Let's take another break from the West and look at another playground of the imagination, or rather, three related ones: China, Japan, and Korea. Even though these three regions of East Asia had and have very different cultures, languages, and histories, until the Middle Ages, it was the literary forms created in China which tended to shape those of Japan and Korea. The educated elites of those countries were taught classic Chinese works and how to compose their own poetry in the Chinese language and in Chinese characters. This began to change in Japan in the 9th century CE, as the Japanese system of characters used today began to develop from the Chinese system of ideograms, and people from outside the aristocracy, as well as women from within it, began to write in the Japanese language. A similar development took place in Korea several centuries after that. We find the imagination at work in Chinese literature as far back as a type of story called Chanxi, which is associated with the Tang Dynasty of the 8th and 9th centuries CE. These were short pieces, many of which dealt with the kinds of romantic, heroic, and supernatural themes we've already seen in medieval European literature. Some of their stories, which are based on traditional folk tales, deal with ghosts, demons, shape-shifting creatures, and the heroes who defeat them. But there were also Chanxi, which were more interested in historical events. Even the more obviously fictional ones are set in the times of their authors, and they contain more realistic details than we tend to find in European imaginative literature, such as actual locations and aspects of current society, like the important government exams taken by applicants for jobs in the Chinese civil service. Some of the heroes were women. In one story, a giant serpent demands that the nearby town send it a young woman once each year as a sacrifice, until one young woman, named Li Ji, volunteers to go but brings with her a sword and a dog with which she is able to kill the beast. Her bravery comes to the attention of the king, who marries her. In another story, a young man falls in love with a beautiful woman named Ren, who lures him to her mansion where they spend the night. It turns out that there is no mansion there, only ruins, and the woman is actually a Uli Jing, or fox spirit, who can take the form of either a fox or a woman. The young man marries her anyway, and they're happy, but when he takes her on a journey to a new post he has received, she is chased by hunting dogs and turns back into a fox, only to be killed by them. Stories of fox spirits are still being told today. Another famous Zhuangzi is the story of a man named Lu Yi, who is traveling home when he encounters a beautiful woman who appears to be a poor shepherdess, but is actually the daughter of a dragon king who lives in an underwater palace made of precious stones. She is unhappy because the man to whom she has been married, the son of another dragon king, is neglecting and abusing her. So she asks Yi to help her by taking a letter to her father. He does this, and by the end of the story, he has married the princess and become immortal. Then there's the story of Du Zichun, who becomes the apprentice of a Taoist priest who asks him to help prepare an elixir which will make him immortal. He's told that he must remain silent throughout the process, no matter what happens to him. And he does so even when he is killed by demons. But he's reborn as a young woman and lives a new life, including marrying a man and giving birth to a child. But when the child is killed, he finally cries out, only to find himself back with the priest at the moment he began to make the elixir. The priest tells him that having given in to love, he can never become immortal. We find something similar to the medieval European romance we looked at recently in the stories called Yosha, whose heroes were wandering knights who were skilled in the martial arts and helped people in need. One of these stories is about a man named Mo Le, a foreigner from Southeast Asia. Though he has become a slave, he helps his young master to liberate the woman he loves, who has been forced into the harem of a powerful court official. He's able to do this because he is supernaturally strong, and like Superman, he can leap over high walls and cover great distances. And in addition to his physical strength, he seems, like many of the figures in these stories, to have been made immortal through some elixir, since years later he is found selling medicine and he looks exactly the same. When Tsui, Mole's master, reaches the room of his beloved, she asks him, "What magic powers do you have that could get you all the way here?" Tsui told her all about Mole's plan and how he had come over the walls on Mole's back. She asked, "Where is Mole now?" He said, "Right outside the curtain." She invited him in and served him wine in a golden bowl. Then she told Tsui, "I eat with jade chopsticks, perfume myself with incense burned in a golden censer, and live and sleep among folding screens of mica and embroidered silk blankets. Yet none of this is my desire, and I might as well be a prisoner in chains. Since your worthy servant has magical powers, couldn't he help me escape from this prison?" Mole said, "Since my lady is so determined, it is but an easy thing to do." Mole first carried the courtesan's belongings out, going back and forth 3 times. Then he said, "It's getting too close to dawn." So he carried both Tsui and the courtesan on his back and flew over the 10 layers of walls. Not one of the minister's guards detected them. They returned to Tsui's study and hid the courtesan there. During the Ming and Qing dynasties, between the 14th and the 18th centuries, some of the world's first novels were written in China, in the sense of extended prose narratives with a clear structure and well-developed characters. But when it came to works of prose, Chinese intellectuals traditionally preferred works of history over more imaginative stories, and the novels of this period also tend to have realistic settings and situations. In fact, of the 4 classic novels that emerged during these centuries, only one, Journey to the West, which we've already discussed, is full of completely fantastic elements like magic, intelligent but non-human creatures like monkey, non-terrestrial realms like an underwater world, and devices like pills that grant immortality. But it has also remained the most popular of the novels and has inspired many modern media, like a 1970s Japanese TV series, a 1986 Chinese adaptation, a 1999 cartoon, and a 2010 game. Now let's move on to Japan. Our earliest records of Japanese myths are contained in 2 books from the 8th century CE, the Kojiki, or Account of Ancient Matters, and the Nihon Shoki, Chronicles of Japan. Like the work of the early Greek author Hesiod, these books describe the creation of the world and the birth of the gods, or kami. They go on to describe the creation of Japan itself and the origin of the Japanese emperors. Though they trace the imperial line all the way back to Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun, in the 7th century BCE, only those emperors from the 7th century CE and onwards seem to have been actual historical figures. The creation of the world is described as follows: a formless chaos stretched across heaven and earth until the first divine spark flickered to life. As layers of heaven and earth settled into place, a council of heavenly deities decided to create a solid world. 2 younger kami, Izanagi and Izanami, were handed a jeweled spear called Ame no Nuboko and sent down to stir the briny depths. When droplets fell from the spear's tip, they solidified into the first island, Onogoro. There, on a floating bridge of heaven, Izanagi and Izanami married and fashioned 8 more islands, Awaji, Shikoku, Kyushu, and the others, each born in turn with poetry and ceremony. Their union gave rise to countless kami: Amaterasu Omikami, radiant goddess of the sun, Tsukuyomi, lord of the moon, and Susanoo, storm-wielding trickster. During the Heian period, beginning in the 9th century CE, a new type of literature appeared which contained many imaginative elements. This genre, called monogatari, or word thing, was characterized by long narratives which were essentially fictional even when they were describing historical events. Unlike earlier works, which were influenced by the literature of the Chinese court, the Monogatari were composed in Japanese and reflected Japanese ideas and settings. One of the most famous of these is the Genji Monogatari, which was written by an aristocratic woman known by her pen name Arasaki Shikibu, the Lady in Purple, daughter of the Minister of Ceremonial Affairs. This is the story of the fictional son of a fictional emperor named Genji, who is not acknowledged as royalty but manages to play an important part in the imperial court. The plot, which covers Genji's entire life, involves the schemes he uses to gain political power and his personal life, which is a series of love affairs, some more successful than others. Another common Japanese narrative during this period was the Gunki Monogatari. This dealt with a subject which, as we've already seen, was also very popular in medieval Europe: the heroism and the behavior of warriors in battle. One of the most famous of these, the tale of the Heike, was a dramatic epic based on the events of the Genpei War fought in the 12th century between two of Japan's most powerful clans. Like the European epics of the time, it focuses on the stories of specific warriors and how they act in battle. Some are heroic and virtuous, while others are treacherous, arrogant, or ruthless. Though these particular stories don't contain any elements of outright fantasy, one of the most famous monogatari is full of them. This is the story of Kaguya Hime, or Princess Kaguya, who as a baby is found by a childless bamboo cutter inside a stalk and raised by him and his wife. After only 3 months, she becomes a beautiful young woman who is courted by 5 noble suitors. But because she doesn't want to marry any of them, she asks each one to bring her an object they can't possibly obtain. The emperor himself then discovers her, but she turns him down as well, and reveals to her parents that she had been sent from the moon as a punishment, but must now return there. When the moon people come for her, they offer her an elixir of immortality, which she decides to leave for the emperor, but he refuses to take it because he doesn't want to live forever without her. The plot bears some resemblance to a traditional Chinese folk tale about the woman Chang'e, who also goes to live on the moon, where she flies involuntarily after taking too much of an elixir that gives her immortality. Kaguya's story ends as follows. One of the moon beings in the chariot held a wonderful coat of wings. Another had a vial full of the elixir of life, which was given the princess to drink. She swallowed a little and was about to give the rest to the old man, but she said, "Wait a little. I must not forget my good friend the emperor. I must write him once more to say goodbye while still in this human form." In spite of the impatience of the messengers and charioteers, she kept them waiting while she wrote. She placed the vial of the elixir of life with the letter, and giving them to the old man, she asked him to deliver them to the emperor. Then the chariot began to roll heavenwards towards the moon, and as they all gazed with tearful eyes at the receding princess, the dawn broke, and in the rosy light of day, the moon chariot and all in it were lost among the fleecy clouds that were now wafted across the sky on the wings of the morning wind. The princess's letter was carried to the palace. His Majesty was afraid to touch the elixir of life, so he sent it with the letter to the top of the most sacred mountain in the land, Mount Fuji, and there the royal emissaries burnt it on the summit at sunrise. So to this day, people say there is smoke to be seen rising from the top of Mount Fuji to the clouds. An earlier work, which may have inspired the story of Genji, was called the Utsubo Monogatari, or Tale of the Hollow Tree. Though it's partly about the court intrigues of a fictional member of the Fujiwara clan, which was one of the important political families of that era, and his daughter who, like Princess Kaguya, was courted by many nobles, the first part of the narrative is about a family of musicians who play a magical koto, a kind of harp, which Toshikage, the first member of the family, received from a Buddha when he was shipwrecked in Persia, and which he was taught to play by celestial beings. While stories like Kaguya's were invented by their authors, There were also traditional folk tales, which, like the folk tales of Europe, were eventually turned into written narratives. One of the most famous of these is the story of Momotaro, or Peach Taro. He is a boy who, in one version of the story, is born from a giant peach found by an elderly childless couple. And in another version, he is born to the wife after she eats a peach, which makes her young again. Momotaro goes on a quest to defeat the demons who have been plaguing the land with three friends who are talking animals: a dog, a monkey, and a pheasant. Then there's the story of Uriko, who was similarly born from a melon and found by a couple who adopt her. She, like Kaguya, becomes a beautiful young woman and is engaged to marry a prince, but she is killed by a creature called a yokai, who disguises itself and takes her place because it wants the power that would come from the marriage. Before the wedding can take place, Uriko appears reincarnated as a sparrow, and she sings a warning to the prince that he has been deceived, so the yokai is killed. Another tiny child is Isun Boshi, or 1-inch boy, who was born to an old couple that has prayed to the gods. He is born tiny and never grows any larger, but he goes off to become a warrior. And when a princess in a royal family who has taken him in is kidnapped by a demon, he goes to save her. The demon swallows him whole, but he attacks him from the inside with a sewing needle that he uses as a sword. He then takes the demon's magic hammer and uses it to grow in size so that he can marry the girl himself. Then there's the story of Urashimataro, a fisherman who saves a small sea turtle from a group of children who are abusing it, and is then visited by a much larger turtle who tells him that he has just saved the daughter of Ryujin, the ruler of the sea, who would like him to visit his underwater palace so that he can thank him personally. Urashimataro is given gills so that he can breathe underwater, and he finds that the turtle he saved is now a beautiful woman. He spends only a few days there, and when he decides to go back home to visit his mother, the princess gives him a chest which he is told never to open. But when he gets back, he finds that hundreds of years have passed, and he no longer knows anyone. So, forgetting the princess's warning, he opens the box and immediately turns into an old man, since the box had been holding his old age. One of the taros is a dog, Shipetaro, who helps a warrior to defeat a mountain spirit who has been demanding the yearly sacrifice of a young woman, and whose servants manifest in the form of cats. Finally, there is Kintaro, who was raised on a mountain by a witch and is friends with its animals. In some versions of this story, his father is a dragon. He is unusually strong and defeats the demon that lives there. He then becomes the loyal follower of a samurai named Minamoto no Yorimitsu, who was an actual historical figure. Let's finish by looking at some of the imaginative works of Korea. Tales had always been a part of traditional Korean culture, but they were only written down once similar kinds of works were being composed in China, which, as we said, was a dominant influence on the literary classes of both Korea and Japan. In fact, one of the first Korean works to record these stories was written in Chinese. This was the 13th century Samguk Yusa, which, like similar Japanese works, was a mixture of history and the myths that surrounded the country's foundation in ancient times. The first Korean kingdom, for example, was believed to have been founded before 2000 BCE, after the Lord of Heaven sent his son, Hwanung, down to earth. Hwanung gave people their laws and taught them how to farm and to make tools. He then married a bear who had been transformed into a woman, and their son Tangun became the first king. Like the myths we described at the beginning of this series, these stories are about ancient times when the world was different from the one that we know now. But there are also many Korean folk tales about supernatural creatures that exist in our own world, including ghosts, goblins, and other beings. The ghosts of the dead in these stories tend to be women who cannot move on because they have been wronged in life and want revenge. They may also be the spirits of young women who have died before they could be married and are therefore resentful and harass girls their own age out of envy. Then there are the creatures called tokibi. They aren't evil in themselves, and their job is to dole out the karma that each person has earned, though they can also be mischievous. They have one leg, are good at wrestling, and have special hats that make them invisible, and magic wands. As in Japan, traditional Korean folk tales eventually gave way to original forms of imaginative fiction. In the late 15th century, a collection of new stories, the Kumoshina, was written in Chinese and modeled after a similar Chinese collection that had been printed around 100 years before. It's populated by ghosts, fairies, and the king of the underworld. In one of its stories, a man named Han, who is a good writer, is asked by the Dragon King to come to his underwater palace so that he may compose for him a letter to be read at the dedication ceremony of the building. Han is then given a tour of the palace, but he wakes up and realizes that it was all a dream. In another of the stories, a lonely orphaned man marries a beautiful woman only to find out that she is actually the ghost of a woman who had died in an attack and must now leave him to go on to the underworld. One of the most popular of all Korean fantasies is the 17th century novel The Nine-Cloud Dream. This too was written in Chinese and is even set in China. It's the story of a young monk who lives in a monastery in the mountains and is sent by his master to convey his respects to the Dragon King in his underwater palace. But on the way back, he encounters some fairies who cause him to enjoy himself more than a monk ought to, and as punishment, his master sends him to hell. He is then reborn and lives an entire life full of adventures. He gets the top grade in the civil service examination, meets a famous poet, becomes a military advisor to the emperor, and marries both the daughter of a minister and the emperor's sister. He also takes the fairies as mistresses. Finally, as an old man, he is visited by his master, who wakes him up and shows him that it had all been a dream. Today, the cultures of China, Korea, and Japan are much more independent of one another than they were in the past, but they're also much more closely involved with the West, both borrowing from and contributing to the literature, movies, and animation being produced by the creators of the modern imagination. Next time, we'll return to the West and look at the beginnings of science fiction, fantasy, and horror with the 18th and 19th century literary movement called Gothic. Please remember to like and subscribe.